Welcome here to the Eisenhower National Historic Site and our World War II weekend. It is my great privilege to introduce our next guest speaker, a good friend of the Eisenhower National Historic Site. But 80 years ago, hell was 4 miles above the earth. Into the Cold Blue is the memoir of B-24 pilot John Homan, who endured 34 combat missions over Europe in 1944. In 2024, Homan co-authored his memoir over with Dr. Jared Frederick, sharing his stories of the air war in Europe, and one of the last great memoirs of the Second World War. Dr. Frederick joins us to share Homan's story and shed light into the dangerous missions, exhilarating experiences, and dedication to freedom shared by Homan in his memoirs. Dr. Jared Frederick has a lifelong passion for American history. Prior to his current position as a history professor at Penn State Altoona, Frederick served as a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park and Harpers Ferry National Historic Park. He is the author of several books, including Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion, Hang Tough, The World War II Letters and Artifacts of Major Dick Winters, and Fierce Valor, the true story of Ronald Speirs and his band of brothers. He has appeared on C-SPAN, PBS, numerous National Park Service productions, and various documentaries. In 2019, he acted as a guest host on Turner Classic Movies for the channel's 25th anniversary. He is also the host of the popular YouTube channel Real History, which examines history versus Hollywood. His latest book, Into the Cold Blue, explores the World War II experiences of co-author and B-24 veteran pilot John F. Homan. It's my privilege to hand over the podium to Jared.
Thank you all for joining me this afternoon, or this morning rather, at the wonderful Eisenhower National Historic Site, one of my favorite places to visit here in Gettysburg. So thank you to all of you for your dedication to history. I've written a number of books on the Second World War, but about 2 years ago, I determined that I very much wanted to write a book with, and not merely about, a World War II veteran. And I did this realizing that the opportunity to do so was quickly diminishing. Of the 16 million Americans who wore military uniforms during the Second World War, there are only about 75,000 of them that are left. And so we have less than 1% of our World War II veterans remaining, and the opportunities to collect those stories are quickly diminishing. That leads us to the gentleman who we see up on the screen, a spry young lieutenant 80 years ago, now a very sharp 100-year-old man who, though all initially hesitant to share his story, had trust in me to impart his experience, his year-long odyssey with you, readers, a broader audience. And I'll start off with a little bit of geographic context here for us. And we'll start by taking a look at the map. This was the area of operations for the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force. And at 1 o'clock this afternoon, you'll have the opportunity to hear John Orloff, screenwriter of Masters of the Air. And by 1945, the 8th Air Force truly was a master of the air over Western Europe. What we see here on the map are not only countries, but cities in which John Homan flew over, bombed, or dropped supplies to, or sometimes over which missions were scrubbed. So I think this little bit of geographic context is very valuable for us as we start off, just to underscore the vastness of this theater of operation. Our story, though, does not begin in Western Europe. It begins in Bath, Maine on January 5th, 1924. That is when John Homan comes into the world, and one of the earliest photographs that we have of him is this adorable little portrait of him sitting atop a pony. And I think I have a photo of my own grandfather sitting atop that same pony by the traveling photographer. That was a very popular thing to do with your children in the 1920s. And from an early age, by the time John was in 4th or 5th grade, when the photograph on the left was taken, his family had moved to Sayreville, New Jersey, where his grandfather was employed in a gunpowder plant located there. They had endured a fairly rough existence during the time period of the Great Depression, as had many American families, but that did not stifle John's sense of adventure or daring. By the time he was a teenager, he had joined a band of misfits, a local gang that was known as the Roamers, who looked very similar in my imagination to the sort of slick-haired, leather jacket-wearing bad boys that we see in the photograph on the right. And some of John's misadventures we chronicle in the book. Others he told me we had to censor because he didn't want to send a bad impression to his great-grandson, who was about this age at the same time. But one of the most wonderful stories of his upbringing is my conversation that I had with him about his adventure to the 1939 World Fair in New York City. He's the only person I've ever met who had the chance to go to the World's Fair. And what impressed him most at the World's Fair was Jimmy Lynch and his daredevil drivers. These were stunt drivers, and John very much aspired to that sort of flair and exuberance. So much so that he determined that he was going to try to replicate some of the daredevil's maneuvers with his dad's Willie's car on the sand dunes of New Jersey. And so one night he mustered up the courage to try this, and he decided that he was going to try to make the car go airborne, jump off of one dune and land on another. Unfortunately, it did not work out as anticipated, and rather than landing on the opposite dune, he landed on the gully in between, thereby breaking the suspension on his father's car. And as John sheepishly admitted to me during our interviews, he said that car never drove straight ever again. John had never been in an airplane by that point, even as the Second World War had started. He had never even been in an airplane, let alone contemplated the possibility of learning how to fly an airplane. But here we see that he had the desire to go airborne, and that desire wasn't going to diminish anytime soon. When Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th, 1941, many of John's friends within the Roamers were 18 years of age, but John was one of the younger members of that gang, and therefore he had to wait. There was no way that his mother was going to allow him to enlist with the parental permission at age 17, so he was going to have to play a waiting game. And even when he turned 18 years of age and was legally able to enlist of his own ambition, his mother still did not want him to join up. And even though he could have enlisted anyway, he very much loved his mother. He did not wish to defy her wishes. And as a result, he hatches up a daring plan. He goes to his local draft board and he says to them, he tries to make a secretive agreement with them. And he says, if you would, please call my draft number. I want you to draft me. I can't enlist transparently, so I want to be drafted. And they agreed to do this. And they made an unwritten pledge with him that they were going to abide by this secret pact. And so John was feeling very strong and very confident about himself. And he thought, I'm going to get away with it. My draft number will be called soon enough. And then he was disappointed and shocked to find this little bit of news piece in his local periodical on January 15th, 1943. And that article said 5 men were withdrawn from the list of those to be sent to Newark by the local draft board Tuesday for examination. John F. Homan of 16 Henry Street, Parlin, who appeared before the board requesting that he be admitted to the Army at once, was added to the list. And with that, the cat was out of the bag. That is how his mother found out that he was joining up in the United States Army, and she was none too pleased when he got home. But in any case, he was in the Army now, as the old saying goes, and the photograph on the left there is his high school graduation photograph. Because of the popularity and demand of the United States Army Air Forces, though, they required some sort of college education or technical training before you could enter. And therefore, John had to enter the infantry before he could get into the Air Forces. And he had to take a lot of schooling and night courses once he was in the Army. But he is able to work his way through that. And he is eventually able to work his way to aviation cadet school. And he will do most of that schooling at various air bases in Alabama, including Moody Field and what is now Maxwell Air Force Base. And during some of his downtime, he might have the opportunity to venture to Montgomery, Alabama. And that is where he is seated in this picture in front of the Alabama State House, right next to the statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, no less. This photograph was the favorite of John's girlfriend named Irene, the girl who he left behind back in New Jersey. She thought that this photograph evoked a certain boyish charm. And then when he got home in 1945, she was absolutely shocked that this young boy had disappeared. And in her view, he had grown into somewhat of a haggard, middle-aged man. And so this photograph serves as a very valuable lesson in contrast and aging and what war does to our facial features for those who endure it. But you may be able to spot here in the foreground of the photograph that he is wearing a small ring on his pinky finger, and that was a good luck token given to him by Irene, and he would wear that ring on every combat mission that he flew in the subsequent year. Before he learns to start to fly the big heavy bombers, he's starting out with some very notable training aircraft that was made available to him in Alabama and later on in Georgia. One of his favorite of these was the Boeing PT-17 Stearman, which we see in the upper left-hand corner, which is usually painted a very distinctive yellow or blue, so it could be easily recognizable during these training purposes. In the photograph in the middle, we see John in his flight suit on the far left, right after a briefing, getting ready to head off into the cold blue once more here. Where he spent a good bit of time training is the postcard that he sent to Irene that we see in the background. This is Souther Field in Americus, Georgia. And while he was at Souther Field, he also learned how to fly the BT-13, which he did not hold in as high regard as the Stearman. In fact, he referred to the BT-13 as the Vultee vibrator because he said it seemed like you were trying to fly a lawnmower because of how much that it would be shaken. He said we had to put additional cushions in the seats because we were all too short to reach the pedals that were at the bottom front of the cockpit. And suffice it to say, he did not have a high opinion of the Vultee. But he overcomes all of these challenges, he completes his training, and in January of 1944, he earns his commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Forces, and he also gets his highly covetous flight wings, and even better yet, his very stylish chocolate Class A dress uniform. This is what he aspired to attain most. This sets him in a whole other class of distinction. And he said corporals and sergeants weren't going to be yelling at me anymore. And that was one of the things that he was very eager to embrace. The first thing that he does when he gets back to New Jersey and has 2 weeks leave after he obtains his commission is that he goes to a photography studio where a good friend works. He takes his girlfriend, Irene, with him, and he has a series of portraits taken. So he's a bit enamored with himself in some of these images. He has 6 different pictures taken, and some of them he's wearing his crusher cap. There's others that he's holding a pipe. He looks very debonair in all of them. And I said, John, what was the catalyst for this sort of excitement? What was your aspiration in being a photo boy as such? And he said, well, I couldn't grow a mustache, but I nonetheless wanted to be like Clark Gable. That is exactly what he wanted to do. So, yeah, 2 very debonair young men here, I think we could say. And I'm happy to say that John still has that uniform today, and there he is, standing next to it 80 years later. To his regret, he can no longer fit in his uniform. But as I was helping him to put it on a mannequin and put it on display in promotion with our book, he was sitting in there in the chair as I was dressing it up, and he said, "Damn, that still looks good." So he is still a bit enamored with his uniform all of these years later. And you'll notice that there are a number of ribbons that are later affixed to that uniform jacket as well. And we're going to be talking about how he will be getting some of those ribbons in our forthcoming slides. One thing, though, that John stressed to me, was that he didn't want this merely to be a book about him. He is not a braggadocious sort of person. He's very humble. He's very reserved. Not once, as I was conducting dozens of hours of interviews with him, did he get emotional? Did he break down? Did he get tearful? He's very matter of fact. In any case, he said, "I don't want this to be merely a story about me. I want it to be a story about my crew. And I want the story of our crew to be representative of the airman experience during the Second World War." And that's what I set out to do ultimately. And I had a great stroke of luck in the fact that I was able to find personal records, reminiscences, diaries, and flight logs of 3 of his crewmates at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force in Savannah, Georgia, combined with the mountain of material that John has in his personal possession. And so to have written accounts of 4 men within a 10-man crew, as far as I know, is fairly unparalleled. And so I had a vast treasure trove of material to work with. And it is my hope that I gave these 10 men justice. The 4 lieutenants that we see in the back, John is second from the left, and the 6 sergeants that we see in the foreground. These men were very much a family, and I'll be imparting to you some of their stories of camaraderie here very shortly. I'll first introduce you, though, to the plane that they flew, and that is the B-24 Liberator. And it is still a fierce, if not playful, debate among World War II veterans and aviation fans today of what is the better airplane of the Second World War, the B-17 or the B-24. Certainly, the B-17 might have a little bit more maneuverability. It is not quite as gangly as the B-24. Some pilots called the B-24 the ruptured duck. John Lucky Luckadoo of the 100th Bomb Group, he said that the B-24 was the box that the B-17 was mailed in. And that's how he kind of playfully describes it. But all that said, despite its somewhat awkward appearance, it has greater fuel range than the B-17, and it also has a heavier bomb load than the B-17. And in certain circumstances, that could benefit you in the long run. In this chart, which we have at the beginning of the book, outlines where each of the 10 crewmates was positioned within the aircraft. And so readers can have easy reference so we don't get characters or positions mixed up. But John is located at position number 5. He is the co-pilot for 2 different B-24s in the European theater of operation. His crew is assembled in Casper, Wyoming in late 1943, and he said there was nothing like training in Wyoming during wintertime. But by May of 1944, they are given instructions to fly to Site X. They don't know necessarily where Site X is, though they are given the coordinates for it. So in mid-May of 1944, they start leapfrogging their way across the continental United States from Wyoming, through the Midwest, up to New England, until they ultimately find themselves in Goose Bay, Labrador. A massive airstrip had been constructed in Labrador there over the previous year to accommodate this huge flow of air traffic that will be funneling across the North Atlantic. And that is where they begin their journey to the European theater. It was somewhat of a precarious mission. It's 14 hours long. And at one point, they put the aircraft on autopilot and everybody falls asleep aboard the ship. So a bit nerve-wracking, if you would ask me. But nonetheless, they made it. One really good incentive to try to stay awake is John said, I looked out the cockpit window and it was just one continuous flow of ice. And he said, if we crashed into that, we realized that there was no way of saving us. So a very memorable flight here across the Atlantic, and that was the only time that he would fly across the Atlantic in the co-pilot's seat. They eventually end up at a base in East Anglia that will be called Halesworth. And they arrive in the United Kingdom around Memorial Day, 1944. And immediately, John senses that there is something massive afoot. All of the officers on these bases were ordered to wear their sidearms. There's a certain energy and there's a certain hustle that can be felt on these air bases. And a few days later, John finds out why. Because he arrives in the United Kingdom about 1 week, less than a week in fact, before D-Day, June 6th, 1944. John had very much hoped that his crew would have the opportunity to participate in what General Eisenhower called the Great Crusade. But unfortunately, when they arrived in the United Kingdom, their plane was taken away from them and given to another crew. They had been used as nothing more than glorified delivery boys to take a plane for another outfit. And as a result, he had to sit out the onset of the Normandy Invasion, something that I think still to an extent disappoints him to this very day. But there was still plenty of war left to be fought, and John was going to be front and center in it. All of those missions were going to originate out of here, the Halesworth airfield, not too far away from Norwich in the United Kingdom. This is an aerial photograph showing us what that airstrip looked like. And you'll notice all these sort of round pockets that originate out of one of the runways. Those are called hard stands. Those were glorified parking spaces for these B-24s, and it allowed the Army Air Forces to space out the planes on the bases. The Army had learned the hard way at Pearl Harbor, where all of the heavy bombers and aircraft had been parked together in close proximity to guard against the possibility of sabotage. And they quickly found out the downside of that once the Japanese attacked it. And so the strip was purposely spread out over a fairly large geographic area, and that was to prevent accelerated damage in case the Germans became very bold and decided to launch an air raid against this strip or other strips. You can still sense the footprint of the Halesworth airfield today. We can kind of see the original runways there that intersect with one another. Down here where the red pin is, there is a memorial museum dedicated to John's group, the 489th Bomb Group. Interestingly enough, though, it is largely now a solar and wind farm. And that is used almost as a point of pride by the local population, because they make the argument that in 1944, this site was a place of cutting-edge technology, and they kind of advertise it as such today. So it's not necessarily the best preserved of World War II air bases that we can find in England, but it's certainly not the worst preserved either. One of the other really wonderful benefits of teaming up with John is the vast amount of period photography that he has. He had a camera with him. And this is perhaps my favorite photograph that he took. And he took it within his barracks. And the original photo was only about 1 inch by 1.5 inches. And when you scan it at 2,400 dots per square inch, you can make it big enough to plaster up on a wall. We have these beautiful images. And I've since been able to connect with the family members of many of John's crewmates. And it's been a very rewarding experience for me to be able to send these photographs on to the grandchildren and children of these individuals, photographs that they had never seen before. And it's like bringing the past to life to a little bit. But the young man that we see sitting on this cot is John Dalglish, whose nickname was Pup, and he was the bombardier on John's plane. And John said that Pup was a little bit of a loner. He didn't always mix well with others. And while they might be playing poker in the barracks, Pup would just kind of go sit in the corner and sit there by himself quietly. And lo and behold, the photograph that I find of him here in the mix shows exactly that. And I am quite certain that is a serious poker game going on there in the background. And all the shoes in the foreground. It's a wonderful literal snapshot of airman life in England in 1944. There are some remnants of other features of the base that still exist. Some of the brick yet overgrown walls of the headquarters building. The Norden bomb site storage area, which was considered one of the best kept secrets of the war. Cutting edge technology, a predecessor of an analog computer that would allow supposedly for greater precision bombing, technology that was so sophisticated that they would take it out of the bombers at night after the planes arrived back, and they would put them under lock and key and military police guard until the next mission. Part of that still remains. Some of the best preserved buildings on base is where John began every morning. And that was the combat mess facility, which is now a construction firm there on the property. But the inside of one of those buildings would have looked very much like this. And not only did I learn about base life, but I also learned about the airman diet. These are the sort of minuscule everyday things that John was able to impart to me. And one thing that he said that surprised me is that airmen could not be fed beans, cabbage, or gas-producing foods. And that sounds very funny at first. Like, did they not want to stink up the plane? Like, what was the motivation behind that? But in reality, when you're flying at 20,000 feet in an airplane that doesn't have any compressed air, that sort of food can create acute gastrointestinal distress. And airmen could actually become sick or incapacitated as a result of that pain. And so even what they ate every morning had to be calculated and carefully pre-planned. It speaks to the sort of precision that they had in mind. This, though, is John's office, and his chair would have been the one on the right. It's something that John told me is as they were on the flight line, waiting for planes ahead of them to take off, he would close his eyes, he would run his hands up the consoles, across the panel, down the console, in the middle, and to the front, and he would memorize where every knob, lever, and button and gauge was located. And he did this to train himself, so if he found himself in a rough situation, he could immediately go to that button or switch to rectify one situation or another. So he was always preparing for this sort of worst case scenario. And I think it also speaks to one of the inherent ironies of military service during World War II. He's 20 years old as he's flying these missions. In 1944, as this is today, he couldn't buy a beer if he wanted to. In 1944, he also couldn't vote as well. That's still a few years away. Yet, he is entrusted with a $300,000 aircraft to rain war and destruction upon the enemy. You know, kind of the strange limitations of American civic life, I think. This is how many of those airmen would dress. Pretty much look like Eskimos. And they would have these large, often fleece-lined or sheepskin wool-lined suits that were also electrified. And they would be able to plug these suits or the underwear within them into outlets at the various stations within the plane. And there was a literal thermostat beside each station that allowed them to be protected against the sometimes sub-zero, certainly freezing temperatures that were located outside. You often wear a flak vest on top of that to try to protect you from bits of shrapnel, and then you would pang out the ears and put additional like Mickey Mouse ear flaps on top of a typical infantryman helmet, so your radio equipment and gas mask could fit more comfortably underneath. John flies his first mission on July 6th, 1944, exactly 1 month after D-Day, and initially he thinks, this combat mission stuff isn't so rough. I can do this. I can handle it. But he changes his mind completely on July 7th, 1944. This is his true wake-up moment as to what the horrors of combat entail. His group lost a number of planes. He saw them being shot down firsthand. Many more were gravely damaged. And there was one B-24 that was heavily damaged in this encounter that came up to his right wing. And what John noticed is that the top turret on that plane was completely shattered. It had been fully blown away. And stemming from that blown away turret was a streak of blood that went the whole way to the tail of the plane. It beheaded and completely eviscerated the gunner who was within that position, and his remnants were smeared the whole way to the rear of the plane. And John said that was something that always stayed with me. And even years later, that was one of the few really gory sights that would come back to him in his dreams. And it wasn't until we were writing this book that John learned the identity of that young man who was killed over Aschersleben, Germany on July 7th, 1944. And it was this sergeant right here whose name was Paul W. Redden. So to speak about this fatality in the abstract is one thing. To put a human face to it is something entirely other. Paul Redden was about to celebrate his first wedding anniversary. So he never had the opportunity to celebrate a wedding anniversary with his wife. He was 21 years of age. And it's important that as we think about these huge air armadas, that we not think of them in terms of statistics, that we think of them in the context of the personal. I think that's a fine way to memorialize these individuals. To blow off steam, John, his crew, and many other crewmates head to London. Incredibly cosmopolitan. John said it was the city that never slept. And he recognized this international coalition that was there. And he said there were Australians and Poles and Dutch and South Africans, and people from all over the globe. And he realized then and there, wow, this really is a world war. This really is a vast allied coalition that is waiting for these big leaps in the United Kingdom. It was also there where John began to recognize the civilian costs of the war, thanks in no small part to these flying contraptions, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 flying rockets launched by the Germans on the main continent. They fly across the English Channel or the North Sea. John referred to them as "to whom it may concern" weapons, because once they run out of fuel, they plummet to the ground and they strike anywhere indiscriminately. And John was able to get this photograph where we see just entire city blocks of London that have been leveled by these so-called buzz bombs. As a matter of fact, this young lieutenant that he photographed in here is named Robert E. Crotty, and his plane was shot down a mere 2 weeks after this photograph was taken, and he became a prisoner of war for the duration of the conflict. On a brighter note, John took a great enjoyment in the sights and scenes to be found here in this place in Piccadilly Circus. This was the true hub of activity for Allied service members. If you were of a certain adventurous persuasion, this was the place where you could easily find prostitutes and where to find out information on the brothels in London, which John assured me that he never took part, and I believe him. But also, these were great venues and opportunities to horse around with your crewmates. Like I said, blow off steam. And this is another great photograph of his crew that John took of a bar in London, and it really underscores that sense of brotherhood. And he said, even though in a strict sense, the lieutenants and the sergeants should not have palled around with one another, he said we ignored that entirely. And when we tried to take our sergeants into officers' clubs, we would usually be chased out by the MPs who insisted that our fellow comrades had to leave. It speaks to that sense of camaraderie. And this leads to perhaps my favorite story in the book. Because during one leave in London, the four officers determined that they were going to find a nice cozy nightclub to go to, share a bottle of scotch with one another. And sure enough, they found this shady, speakeasy looking place where they had to give a password in order to get in. They go down into this dark basement. They get a table right at the front of the stage. There's a performer who's up on the platform who is singing a song. And shortly after the lieutenants sit down, a bottle is flung out of the audience and hits the performer in the face. And the male singer concluded his song, but when he finished, he called out to the audience. He said, "The man who threw that bottle ought to be man enough to stand up and admit it." At that very same moment, there was an intoxicated Dutch paratrooper who was in the back of the room who did not speak English and stood up at that very same time to use the restroom. The MC in the club interpreted that as a confession of guilt on the part of that paratrooper, comes over and punches him in the face. An American paratrooper sergeant who is sitting in the other corner will not tolerate such an assault on one of his paratrooper brethren, even if he's from another country. He rises up and goes over and punches the MC in the face for punching the Dutch paratrooper. You get a sense where this is going. In true Hollywood fashion, the entire bar breaks out in an inter-service international brawl. And John said, "We just wanted to have a drink of scotch." And suddenly we found ourselves amidst a new Allied offensive in this bar. The four of them, though, continued to just sit there, take sips of their scotch, and saw the mayhem unfold around them. The name of that bar, appropriately enough, was the Nut House. That's the name of the chapter in which we talk of that book. But in the following days, it was back to business. And in late July of 1944, in reaction to the stalemate that is happening in Normandy hedgerow country, the 8th Air Force, including John's bomb group, is tasked to participate in Operation Cobra. This would be a series of saturation bombings that would break up the German defenses within Normandy and open up a thoroughfare to allow the Allied advance to continue moving. And bombs were dropped here with great effect. The German defenses are broken up, and these aerial photographs really speak to the level of devastation that is inflicted there. Unfortunately, one of the infamous downsides of these series of missions is that several hundred American GIs on the ground were killed by friendly fire by their own bombs. And this is where a twist of irony comes into our story, because one of the people in proximity to this incident was my own grandfather, serving in the 4th Infantry Division at this very same time. So definitely a little bit of irony there. And I told John that little factoid, and he said, "Well, I'll be damned." And he's glad none of the bombs fell on my grandfather's vicinity, for sure. This is not to say that the Air Forces wasn't having a lot of damage on such missions as well. The photograph in the upper left is a very vivid bit of testament to this fact. Some of these planes came back to Halesworth looking like big hunks of Swiss cheese with holes in them. And somebody else that John wanted to give credit to were the ground crews, the mechanics, because he said our missions would not have been possible without them. And they worked by day, we flew by night, and it was just a constant cycle of motion and energy. And so that's another segment that he wanted to give credit to. By the time we get to August 6, 1944, John flies lucky mission number 13, striking the oil refineries at Hamburg. And we can see those facilities on fire on the left-hand side of this screen. This was another incredibly grueling mission that the 489th Bomb Group went through. And John saw a number of B-24s explode in midair into these massive fireballs. And he said the wings would often just fold in on themselves and then go at a death spiral. And he said in so many instances there was just no chance for anybody to get out of such circumstances. So this was a really rough mission. They get back to Halesworth, and their commanding officer has a surprise for them. He said, "Fellas, we have a live musical concert here for you. Glenn Miller and his band are here to perform some hits for you." And this is a photograph from that very day in the very hangar. So John is in this sea of humanity here within the photograph, and we can see Glenn Miller playing his trombone right there on the makeshift stage. For John, this is one of the most surreal moments of his war, because he said 3 hours earlier, I was seeing my friends die in combat, and now here I am tapping my toes to Chattanooga Choo Choo. And it speaks to the sort of emotional roller coaster that airmen found themselves in. They could go blow off steam in London. They had hot meals and fresh bed sheets. They had a degree of comfort in their lives, but they had to balance that with the horrors in the combat zone that they saw day in and day out. So that's a stark memory in John's mind. Something that alleviates a little bit of that pressure, something that happened 80 years ago, just about last week. And that's a little known incident in the war known as Operation Trucking. And this is where the 8th Air Force was delivering supplies to starving French civilians in the vicinity of Orléans. And to John, this felt very rewarding because he felt, now I'm saving lives rather than taking them. I'm delivering supplies rather than dropping bombs. But while he was here in Orléans, a French civilian goes up to him and gives him this souvenir, which John still has on his office desk today. And that is a wooden German bullet that was found somewhere on the front. And John still has that still. Let me grab a sip of water here real quick. The very next mission, which happened 80 years ago, just a few days ago, was John's most perilous mission of all. And that was to drop supplies to beleaguered paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne the day after Operation Market Garden commences in Holland. This mission was very atypical for John, because rather than flying at 24,000 feet, he's flying at 500 feet. And he's dropping parachutes rather than bombs. And this was, in his words, a Murphy's Law mission. Everything that seemingly could go wrong did go wrong. He drops the supplies to the paratroopers, drops them right on target. But by this point, 2 engines have gone out. The tail is shot out. The hydraulic lines are severed. The interior of the plane starts to fill up with fog. He's mostly blinded by that fog. He can't even see his pilot, who's sitting 2 feet away from him. The plane is shot to bits. There's no sound or logical reason as to how or why he could have survived this mission. But somehow, they're able to get this plane back across the North Sea to emergency airstrip in England. And that's where they hang on for the hairiest landing of their lives. And John recalls of this moment, "We skidded uncontrollably off the airstrip. I don't think I ever held the controls tighter. I gritted my teeth. There was a feeling of helplessness in our efforts to halt the aircraft. The sensation was like being hurled from a massive slingshot with little power to control direction. The experience was utterly terrifying." Yet somehow, they survived this mission, even though their plane did not. And that was the end of his B-24 that was named Joe, J-O. And with that, they get a new B-24, which is called Rebel Gal, which has a scantily clad blonde painted on the nose, which was quite customary to Allied aircraft. But for that very same mission, John receives the Distinguished Flying Cross. So it was truly an act of valor that allowed him to get his crewmates home. And not long after that very desperate mission, his crew is sent to what is known as a flak home, or a flak shack, where they could get a little bit of rest and recreation. And while John's crew did just that, they would swim and play tennis, John had another mission in mind. Because his parents were actually immigrants from England. He had family living in the United Kingdom, family that he had never met. And so while he had this little bit of leave in Southport, he determined that he was going to take a 2-hour train ride to the community of Hull. That's exactly what he did. He was given an address in case this eventuality might arise. He wandered through the city. He found the address. He knocked on the door. The door opened up, and inside was his grandmother, who he had never seen in person. And she immediately started to cry. And she said, "You look exactly like your father when he left." She knew immediately who he was without a word having been said. And the two of them embraced there on the stoop of his grandparents' home. You can't make this stuff up. And he said, considering all of the emotional turmoil that I had gone through over the last 2 weeks, there was nothing that could have made me feel better than being hugged by my grandmother for the very first time, as a world war was underway, no less. And over the next 2 nights, his grandmother, grandfather, and aunt went pubbing. They went bar hopping. And at the end of those 3 days, he went back to the flax shack, and that was the only time that he ever met his English grandparents. It was here in October of 1944, and a very memorable and sentimental memory it was. As John nears mission number 35, which will ultimately allow him to go home, 2 of these missions were over Cologne, Germany, which a few months later were more indiscriminately targeted by the Army Air Forces. And by the end of the war, this is what Cologne looks like. When John was flying missions, they were the Air Forces was still primarily targeting industrial and military bases and complexes and things like that. Starting in December, January, February 1945, however, the Americans started to embrace the British strategy of indiscriminate bombing, being less picky in their targets, and this is the end result of a lot of that. And I think it leads to this important conversation on the moral gray areas of waging a world war, because it leads to this important question of how much do you need to embrace evil in order to defeat evil? Do you need to become a little bit like your enemy in the name of the greater good? And what do you sacrifice in turn when you're compelled to do that? These are tough questions that I don't have the answers for, but the stories of the dead and the war compel us to at least think about it. And certainly places like Cologne beg us to do so. John's final mission comes 2 days before Armistice Day in 1944. This is a mission that was ordered directly by General Patton himself to lessen up the tactical congestion around Metz, France. And this is the installation that John will bomb on that final mission, Fort Driant, which was actually part of the old Maginot Line left over from the First World War. And after he drops his bombs, he becomes ecstatic because he realizes that he is going home. What do you think he does when he gets back to base? He starts drinking. Absolutely. He goes into the officers' club, he goes up to the bar, slams his hand on the counter, and he yells out, "Scotch." And he said, "I drank until I could drink no more." He literally went blind that night. And his final mission thereafter was not to fly anywhere, but to navigate his way from the officers' club back to his barracks safely. And during that perilous journey up the wooded pathway, he walked into a tree and he fell down. And he had thought that somebody punched him. And he stood up, he shakes off his trousers, and he says, "You SOB." And he punches the tree back. And he lost this battle. And he said, I was more greatly injured in that battle with that tree than what I was during any combat mission that I flew during the Second World War. So serves a very important lesson. Don't get drunk and then pick a fight with a tree. By mid-December of 1944, John is homebound. Enters in a convoy going across the North Atlantic, and that convoy arrives in New York City on December 23rd, 1944, 2 days before Christmas. And he said that it was a foggy day, but the water was mirror smooth, and just as they were going past the Statue of Liberty, the fog lifted, and everybody was up on deck, and they saw Lady Liberty, and he said everybody was completely quiet. And he said, I had seen the Statue of Liberty more times than I could count. But now, having gone through what he had gone through, he had a whole new appreciation for the Statue of Liberty and what it represented. And he was relieved that New York City was not a pile of ruin like most cities in Europe were that he had seen. John continues his service throughout the duration of the war. He goes on to Texas and Florida, fully anticipating that he'll be deployed to the Pacific, but the atomic bombs render that unnecessary. Before the war's over, he wins the modern equivalent of $50,000 at poker, and he buys a brand new 1942 DeSoto. A 1942 car was as new a car as you could get in the United States in 1945 because of rationing and whatnot. And that car served him well over the next 9 years as he went to Rutgers University on the GI Bill. He married Irene in 1946, and he started a family. He eventually gained employment with Johnson & Johnson and spent the next 35 years of his career working in various sectors of industrial manufacturing. And it wasn't until the 1980s that he finally had the opportunity to reconnect with many of his crewmates. And at one of those reunions, they pledged together that the last man standing amongst them would open up a bottle of champagne and raise a toast to all of those who were no longer with them. And that unfortunate honor befell John in 2013 when the last of his fellow crewmates passed away. And so John has been the last of these 10 men for well over 11 years now. And there's hardly a day goes by where he doesn't think about them. John turned 100 years old in January. The 489th Bomb Group, which is still active today, sent him their unit guidon, their unit flag, as a birthday present. And John is appropriately wearing a pin that says, "I've survived damn near everything." That's very true, including a bout of COVID as well. And in our book, I think he says many poignant things. Chief among them is this, though. And it's a plea for us, it's a plea for the future. He says, bombs are not the answer. Choose democracy. Vote to save the principles that I and millions of others risked our lives to maintain. Hold leaders accountable via the ballot box and our First Amendment rights. Remember that the Pledge of Allegiance is to the Republic and not to a single individual yearning for power. If I were 70 years younger, I'd gladly sign up to fend off the forces of anti-democracy again. But others who are younger will have to resist in a different way this time. All I can do now is offer the lessons from my own life and hope readers take them to heart. And I think these are very wise words from a life exceedingly and luckily well lived. Thank you for coming out to my presentation today.
Thank you so much, Jared. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Frederick, I think I got hand up first, and we'll get back up here to the front. I'll hand you the microphone if you'd like to.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
Was the reason John was allowed to go home, did he complete the 25 missions? And could you just explain how hard that was for a pilot to actually get to 25 missions?
Excellent. So by this point in the war, when John entered the European theater, the mission quota had been raised to 30. And then when he was partway through his missions, it was raised to 35 missions. So this led to great agitation on the part of airmen because they felt like they were trapped in this losing game in which the deck was stacked against them. Amazingly, every man aboard John's plane survives the war. Some of them were injured or wounded on these missions, but that's something that John takes great pride in, that collectively they flew 35 missions and everybody came home. And that in and of itself was a rarity. But John gets into that a little bit, and he says that General Eisenhower and people at SHAEF recognized the fact that they couldn't afford to send experienced airmen home after 25 missions. They needed them longer, especially if the campaign in Europe were to otherwise fall flat on its rear end. John used different language, but I'll tame it down here for us. So yeah, that's how it worked. There was a lot of frustration felt among air bases.
Thank you for your talk and the information for all of us.
Sure.
I was just wondering when, the last slide, when he was speaking about democracy, when that occurred, when he gave that talk.
He said that to me the fall of 2021. Yeah. There we go.
There's a recent book called The Bomber Mafia where they discuss the philosophy of American precision bombing versus the British just carpet bombing at night. And this author makes the case that precision bombing was really a myth. The Norden bomb site couldn't drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. They would drop thousands of bombs on a munitions plant or ball bearing factory and only hit the building in question with single-digit bombs out of thousands dropped.
Correct.
So, can you speak to the issue of how that led to this decision of a change of philosophy?
Yes. So those are excellent points raised, and I think it speaks to a lot of the nuance of the air war as well. Because even though bombs would sometimes fall hundreds of yards, even if not miles off target in time, the intent, I think, is key in these sorts of situations. Because at least to the press and at least to their men, Allied air commanders for the United States were making the argument that we are not purposefully bombing civilians. Of course, there will be collateral damage. And I think a lot of this tied into the propaganda purposes of the Allied war effort, that we're trying to stay above or stay ahead or be more moralistically inclined than our enemy is. But by 1945, there's no love loss. And especially after Allied ground troops enter Germany, they see that these people are die-hard. And there's no such thing as a German that's not a Nazi. At least that's how Allied ground troops saw it. And so increasingly, Americans started to see Germans the same as Japanese. This is an enemy race. We need to annihilate them. And we really don't care if we kill civilians at this point. So it's a temperament and a philosophy and a strategy that evolves over time, and it evolves due to the ground conditions on the ground level. I hope that suitably answers your question.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Maybe two questions. The first one is, did he have air support, fighter air support on all of his missions?
Yes, he loved P-51s. He still does. He likes P-47s too. He referred to these as little friends. On inter-aircraft chatter, they would refer to each other as big brother and little brother. And he said P-47 saved our hide more than once. And he writes about that in a number of occasions throughout the book. So yes, there was air support, and it became greater and more numerous as the war progressed.
And my second one is, my daughter's always feeding me World War II books that she's read. So, you talked about evil becoming more evil than the evil you're trying to conquer, and that seems like maybe that was the mindset of Speirs in your previous book.
Yes, so one of my previous books is a biography on Ronald Speirs, who's one of the key protagonists in Band of Brothers. And for somebody like Speirs, where he famously has this fatalistic attitude that you just need to accept the fact that you're already dead, we see that a lot in airman culture as well. It was really the only way to function, was to accept the fact that there's a strong probability that you aren't coming back. And so I think that sort of gallows attitude was pervasive among people who were constantly in combat. And if anybody would like to talk on a more one-on-one basis or chat afterward, I'm happy to stick around here after the tent. And the next speaker is in a mere half hour where you can learn more about the air war. So thank you for coming out.